Good evening, everyone. My name is Joseph Sendegato. I'm the Regional Marketing Manager for Spalding Rehab Network's Southern region. And I'd like to welcome you this evening to the last of 3 virtual sessions we're hosting in support of our engagement with the Falmouth Road Race 2020 at-home edition. Just a couple of housekeeping details. First, please note that your microphones have been automatically muted for the presentation portion of this evening's event. You may still ask questions during the presentation by using the chat box feature. For those of you familiar with the chat box, if you just roll your mouse over the bottom of the screen, a little menu will pop up and you can just jump right into chat and ask questions. And I'll be gathering those questions to answer at the end of the presentation this evening. We have planned time to answer the questions, and we'll also unmute the microphones and allow you to have contact with our presenter directly. So our presenter for this evening, I'm pleased to welcome Danielle Nardi, Doctor of Physical Therapy and Certified Yoga Teacher, who is joining us from the Spalding Rehabilitation Network outpatient clinic located in Hyannis, Massachusetts. She will be discussing with you tonight the benefits of incorporating yoga into your training routine in our session entitled Yoga for Runners. Without further ado, may I welcome Danielle Nardi.
Thank you, Joe. So I'm going to take a minute and just share my screen with you all so that you can see my presentation. All right. So thank you so much for the introduction, Joe. So I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. So like Joe said, I am a doctor of physical therapy. I currently work at the Spalding Outpatient Center in Hyannis. I'm also a certified yoga teacher. So I've been teaching yoga for about 7 or 8 years, and I do specialize in teaching yoga specifically to athletes and individuals with different mobility considerations, so adaptive and accessible yoga. And I've been running since 2011, and I've run 6 Falmouth road races. This will actually be my 7th. And a little bit about why I'm so passionate about sharing yoga with runners and athletes. I began running in 2011, like I said, and I decided to train for my first marathon with not much running experience under my belt. And to be honest, it was a pretty miserable experience. I was constantly in pain. I wasn't recovering very well. I remember calling my husband from long runs in tears, saying how terrible it was and how I would never do it again. I had pain in my feet, pain in my hips. And I made it through the training and I ran that marathon, and I absolutely loved the experience, enough so that a year later I decided to train for the same marathon. The only difference in my training was that I was doing my yoga teacher training. So I was practicing yoga about 3 or 4 times a week. And I noticed that my running felt stronger. My body was recovering a lot faster. I was not as stressed throughout the entire experience, and I wasn't getting the same aches and pains that I was getting when I was training for my first marathon. And so it really demonstrated to me how much of an effect the yoga was having on my running. And so it led me to dive a little bit deeper into the benefits of yoga for runners and athletes, and to complete a yoga for athletes training with Sage Roundtree, who's written several books on the topic that I'll share the information with you in a little bit. So since then, I've taught yoga for runners and athletes workshops and trainings. I've consistently taught yoga for runners classes at Marathon Sports, both here on the Cape and up in Boston. And I do really love sharing the benefits of yoga with the runners. So here is our plan for the evening. I would love for you to leave tonight and understand a little bit more about what yoga is, if you're not familiar with it, know the benefits of yoga specifically for runners and athletes, and then have an idea of how you can incorporate yoga into your running training plan to really get the most out of these benefits. So what is yoga? Yoga has a 2,000-year history, so we are just scratching the surface with this quick definition. But the word yoga comes from the Sanskrit word of yuj, which means to yoke or bind together. And that's often interpreted as a union. And we think of that in yoga as the union of the mind and the body, or the union of breath and movement together. So oftentimes in yoga, we think of linking our movement with our breath pattern. And the branch of yoga, yoga has 8 branches or limbs, so 8 different components to the overall practice. The practice that we're most familiar with typically in the West is the asana practice, and that's the practice of the yoga poses, the more physical practice. And the physical practice, if you go back into the history and philosophy of yoga, is actually meant to limber up and loosen up and strengthen the body to prepare to sit in stillness for long periods of meditation. So that's the origin of the yoga practice. But like I said, if you're taking a look at these 8 different limbs of yoga, the ones that we're most focused on in kind of traditional Western style yoga class are the asana, or the physical poses, and the pranayama, which is the breath practice of yoga. And then you can see a little farther down the line here, you'll see the intense focus or the state of meditation are additional limbs of the yoga practice. For tonight, we're primarily going to be focusing on the physical practice or the asana practice of yoga. So what are some of the benefits of yoga? So one of the things that I find most interesting in terms of the benefits of yoga is that people have been practicing yoga, like I said, for thousands of years and experiencing these benefits. But it's really not until recently that they started to do a lot of research on the benefits of yoga to really show that there is some actual concrete data that supports these, benefits that people have been experiencing. And just to give you an idea of how much the research is really growing and expanding in recent years, if you looked on PubMed, which is a research database that we use when we're looking for studies, in the year 2013, there was 384 studies. If you searched the term yoga, you'd come up with 384 studies just 7 years ago. In the year 2019, if you searched yoga, you would find almost 5,000 studies. So it really is becoming a really widely researched area. And a lot of insurance companies are actually even funding some of the research because they're starting to recognize the benefits of yoga. So some of the benefits I have listed here. So improve flexibility, strength, balance, posture, increases blood flow, exercise your full range of motion of the joints, promotes a healthy spine, can lower heart rate and improve overall endurance, improves concentration and focus, brings peace of mind, and promotes happiness and well-being. So those are some of the overall benefits. So who can experience these benefits? Who can do yoga? So like I said to you, one of my focuses is adaptive and accessible yoga. So I truly believe that anybody can practice yoga. I think oftentimes in Western culture, we have this misrepresentation of yoga where people feel that they need to be able to put their leg behind their head and be flexible to do yoga. And so these are some of the quotes that I often tell people when they tell me that they can't do yoga. If you can breathe, you can do yoga, because at the end of the day, meditation is a piece of yoga practice. So if you can practice breathing and practice the mindfulness piece, you can practice yoga even without the movement. And then yoga is not about having a flexible body, it's about having a flexible mind. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. But as a yoga teacher and a physical therapist, I've personally shared yoga with individuals in hospital beds, on supplemental oxygen, people with very limited mobility, and we can find a way for everybody to practice a safe and beneficial form of yoga. So one of the things I want to talk about right off the bat quickly is that yoga is such a broad term, and there are hundreds and hundreds of different types and styles of yoga. This list here is by no means exhaustive. This is a small sampling of the different styles of yoga, but just to give you an idea of how different these styles of yoga can be. So something like an Ashtanga yoga or a Bikram yoga is a series of poses. The same poses are performed in the same order every time, and it's a very, very hot room that they practice that in. It's in a very kind of intense, vigorous practice of yoga. And then you can go and do restorative yoga or yin yoga, which is a very relaxing, gentle, more mindfulness-based, gentle stretching-based type of yoga. So I often tell people that if you're looking on a class schedule and you see something just listed as yoga, that tells me absolutely nothing. I don't know what that is, and that you really need to kind of get some more information to know what type of class you're about to walk into if it's just listed as yoga. So this is just a sampling of the different types of yoga, but you can easily either look more up, or if you see a class listed that you're not familiar with, just search it so that you have an idea of what type of yoga you're walking into. So what exactly is yoga for athletes? Personally, I believe that yoga for athletes is not necessarily athletic style yoga. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes I'll see yoga for athletes listed on a class schedule, and they talk about it being a high energy, strengthening based, intermediate to advanced level type of class. And I personally don't believe that's necessarily what yoga for athletes should be. I believe that yoga for athletes should complement the athlete's sport-specific training. So that's where we're going to talk about a little bit about the benefits and how you can use yoga to complement your training. So the specific benefits that we're going to focus on tonight are balance, strength, flexibility, focus, and presence. I personally believe that each of these benefits has both a physical and a mental or a psychological component to it for athletes. And that's how we're going to go through the rest of the presentation, breaking it down, looking at each of these, and then kind of going into a more physical and a more psychological or mental component. So first, in looking at balance, I think oftentimes we think of physical balance, standing on one leg, moving and holding a good steady physical balance, or that idea of proprioception, which if you're not familiar with that term is having an awareness of where your body is in space when you're moving. And physical balance is important, and it can increase core, hip, leg, foot strength. And again, in running, if you came to any of our previous presentations, our first presenter, Pat, mentioned that running is essentially a series of single leg hops or stance. You're always on one leg at a time as you're going through your stride. So it's important to have good balance on one leg. And then strengthening the lower part of that leg to support you in that single leg stance can also help prevent an acute injury. In terms of physical balance, though, there's also balance between right and left and balance between upper and lower. So as runners, we, I think, tend to be very lower body focused. And even in a lot of our strength training, you're thinking strengthening your quads, strengthening your glutes, strengthening your calves and hamstrings. And we tend to be focused on the lower body. So yoga might be a great way for you to bring a little bit of balance in working the upper body, working on some of the postural muscles. And one of the reasons I find this important with runners is if you've ever watched people towards the end of a long race, they're starting to get that like leaning forward, shoulders rounding, fatiguing with those postural muscles because we don't often think to actually strengthen those. So that's a nice way yoga might be able to bring in strengthening of the postural muscles. And then in terms of right versus left, running is a very kind of symmetrical sport. It's one foot in front of the other repeatedly. Whereas this might be a little bit more relevant to, say, a baseball player or a golfer who's always swinging on the same side or always throwing on the same side. They're going to have a lot of repetitive motion on one side of the body, and yoga might be a way that you can begin to balance out right versus left as well. There's also the balance of strength versus flexibility. So in the muscles that we tend to overuse or frequently use in running, you can bring in the stretching or the flexibility component for that. And I think that's often where people do think most of with yoga in terms of working with athletes and runners. Physical and mental benefit is kind of that balance between stress versus rest. So if your running is your stress, your training, the rest is your recovery period. And yoga is a really nice way to see that rest and recovery period. And that's oftentimes why if you look on somebody's training schedule, you'll see rest or yoga on their rest day. And we'll circle back to this in a little bit, but it's really important that if you have rest or yoga built into your training plan, that yoga that you do is actually restful, is providing your body with a rest and a time to recover so that you have that balance and to help prevent burnout or overuse. So strength in yoga, physical strength, again, it can refine the strength of your sport-specific muscles that you work, or it can begin to help you identify some weaknesses or even out imbalances. So again, that single leg stance that we do a lot in yoga is really good for ankle strengthening, for strengthening the foot intrinsic muscles, so all the small muscles in the foot. And those tend to be weak on runners because you put on your sneakers and you go out for a run and those muscles don't really get worked. So the nice thing about yoga is that it's often done barefoot. So a lot of opportunity to really strengthen some of those muscles that get missed in running and that are so important. So those muscles are important, especially for if you've ever suffered with plantar fasciitis. The foot intrinsic muscles are important to strengthen to support that. And then also kind of that scapular or postural muscle strengthening we can address in yoga as well. In terms of the mental component of strength, working through a yoga practice, something that might be different and unfamiliar and might actually feel like a little bit of a challenge for you, is something that you can use to build up that mental strength. And then you can call upon that during a tough race or competition, or even if you're having a bad race or run, that mental strength that you've learned to develop through the yoga practice can be a benefit to you. And then one other muscle that I want to discuss in terms of physical strengthening, I did mention that yoga has a breath practice or a breathing practice called pranayama. And so in breathing in yoga, we focus on using the diaphragm muscle, which is a dome-shaped muscle right under the rib cage. And oftentimes we get stuck using these accessory muscles of breathing, which are the upper chest and neck area. And really we want to be using that abdomen, that muscle right above our abdomen area, the diaphragm. And so yoga breath work can help strengthen the diaphragm, which can help with increased oxygen exchange when you're running. And then the one that most people tend to think about, the flexibility. So this is where most people think of yoga and athletes and needing to be physically flexible. And yoga is great for that. It could help to stretch tight muscles. It can help to encourage your full range of motion of your joints and help to avoid overuse or repetitive use injuries. And then there's the mental flexibility. So as I said earlier, yoga is not just about the physical flexibility, but the mental flexibility. And just trying something new, trying the practice of yoga might be something that is a change for you to be flexible and try that. And yoga also encourages you to be present in the moment with a mindfulness practice, and linking the breath with the movement really helps to bring that awareness to your body as you're moving. And you can kind of take that from the yoga into your running. And then focus and presence. So focus is kind of a concentration or direction of your intention, maybe a, looking inward. And so the difference, the way I look at focus and presence differently is focus is kind of directing your attention. Presence is being aware of your overall surroundings. And we need both of these in running. So when we start running, you typically have a goal in mind, whether it's a distance or a time, and whether you can see the finish line when you start or not, you know that that's where you're headed and that's your focus. But you also need to be aware of your surroundings, especially if you're in a race environment. You need to know where the other people are. You need to be able to see that water stop coming up and adjust your plan accordingly if you need to start heading over that way. We've probably all been in race situations if you've run races and you're headed for that water stop and all of a sudden someone cuts you off because they weren't aware of their surroundings. They weren't aware of their presence and recognizing that they just cut you off. So again, yoga can help to work on these focus and presence pieces with meditation, visualization, the use of mantras, or a pranayama or breath practice. So we're going to go through a couple quick poses where I'm going to point out some of these benefits and how each pose has a little bit of each of them. So it's not like we practice a pose just for one of the benefits. As you can see here, you might initially think this is a balance. We're getting some balance, physical balance out of this pose, and we are. But we're also getting the strengthening of the foot and ankle muscles. We're engaging all of the muscles of that standing leg to keep the hips level and not allowing that opposite hip to drop. You're getting some strengthening also of the external rotator muscles. So that's a group of muscles that's deep to the glutes around the pelvis. And so by holding that leg in the open position, you're strengthening those muscles. You're also getting a stretch of the quads and the adductors along the inside of the leg. And again, with a balance pose, you tend to get focus. We cue in yoga to have a visual focus with a balance pose. So you're getting a little bit of each of the balance, strength, flexibility and focus with just this one pose. With a high lunge pose like this, again, we're getting the balance in an asymmetrical position, one foot in front of the other. And it's almost a running type position. If you look at this, it can be similar to a running stride. So we're strengthening a lot of similar muscles as we do when we're running, engaging all the muscles of the front leg for stabilization. You're also strengthening the trapezius muscles and the extensors of the back and the spine to keep you upright. You're holding the arms overhead. You're getting a stretch at the front of that hip, the left hip that's extended back. You're getting a hip flexor stretch. You're getting a little bit of a calf stretch. You're even stretching the plantar fascia along the bottom of that back foot. And you're strengthening the glutes and hamstrings and the front portion of the lower leg of that back leg. So again, a lot going on with just this one pose, experiencing multiple of the benefits that we talked about. So while the last one was a very similar or familiar position for runners in a kind of stride position, this is going into something completely different. We don't often move laterally in running. If you do, you're probably jumping to get out of the way of something or having to move quickly side to side. So this one has our body in a very asymmetrical and more lateral position. And so here we're getting a nice stretch of one side of the body, but you're also engaging all of the core muscles to maintain and hold your body in that position. You're getting some strengthening of the rotator cuff and the arms around the muscles to hold it up overhead, strengthening the muscles of the neck to, again, hold it in gravity, against gravity in that position. And then you're getting a nice stretch on the adductors, the inside of that front leg, and a little bit of a calf stretch in that front leg. Also a lot of balance to be in this position if you've never tried triangle pose before. But again, balance in a very different way than we're used to doing it in running. So not so much that forward back, but that lateral position. And then downward dog. So this is a familiar yoga pose for a lot of people. First off, it's considered an inversion. Your head is below your heart, and so you're getting some of the benefits of having your head below your heart being in the inversion. We talked about strengthening that diaphragm muscle, the muscle of breathing, and being in this particular position, you're actually, because you're inverted, strengthening the diaphragm against gravity. So you have some good diaphragm strengthening if you engage the diaphragm with breathing in this position. We're also getting some weight bearing through our arms, which we don't often do during running. If you are experiencing this, something probably went wrong. And some arm strengthening just by having the weight bearing go through them, and hamstring stretch, calf stretch, plantar fascia stretch along the bottom of the foot. So again, a lot of, and balancing, because again, we're balancing on our arms here. So a lot of different things in this pose as well. The last example I'm going to show is actually a restorative yoga pose. Excuse me. So this might look like I'm napping, and essentially that's almost what restorative yoga is. So restorative yoga is setting yourself up in a fully supported position. So we use lots of props, lots of blankets and bolsters and blocks. We set ourselves up in these very gentle, relaxing positions where you can allow your body to fully relax. And here again, I'm getting a little bit of a stretch across the front of the chest. The rest of me is fully supported. And typically, maybe you'll be doing a breathing practice. You might be starting to do a meditation or a quick body scan, going from head to toe, noticing where you're holding on to any tension, any place that you might be able to relax, any holding on to any stress. And so restorative yoga is very, very different than the more physical standing poses that I previously showed, but still lots of amazing benefits if you use these practices at the correct time in your training. So when do we use these? So I think this slide is probably the biggest takeaway from the entire presentation. And at the top is a quote from Sage Roundtree, who I did my training with. And she says, "The physical intensity of yoga should be in inverse proportion to the physical intensity of your training." So what does that mean? There's a nice little chart right below it. That means when you're in your off season, You're not training for anything. You're just kind of maintaining base mileage. You're trying to build some aerobic capacity and endurance, building up your strength. What should we do with yoga? That's a great time for a strength-based yoga practice. You're going to continue to build strength, some endurance, a vigorous practice, and that's where you would find a power yoga, a vinyasa yoga, a Bikram yoga. That's the time for those types of practices. When you're training for something and you're starting to build up your mileage, you have a goal, you're working through your training plan, you want something that's going to maybe help you balance that out in terms of flexibility. So you're really using your muscles as you build the endurance and strength. You want to balance it with strength, the flexibility and stretching them out. So you're looking for a hatha style yoga, a slow flow, something gentle, but with some stretching. When you're at your peak point of your training, heading into the taper, at the end of your race training, you want a much more relaxing, gentle yoga practice. So this is where you go into the taper mode and you want everything to be restorative. This is where your body starts to repair, recover, maintain all of that energy to get ready for race day. So again, you want your yoga practice to support that as well. You don't want to then go do a Bikram or vinyasa or more strenuous style of yoga and start to stress or tax the body again. So the way to look at building your yoga into your running training plan is the same way you build your running training plan. So for those of you that have been running for a while and might use very specific race plans, you have tempo runs, you have speed work, you have your long runs. Each of those has an intention or a purpose. So for your speed run, you're training to build your speed. For the tempo run, you might be doing longer distances at a race pace and maintaining that pace. Your long runs are to build the endurance. Yoga needs to be looked at in the same way. It needs to support what you're doing in your training for running in the same way that each run has an intention or a goal. Each yoga practice should have intention or a goal to support your running. I'm going to back up here for one more thing. So just to circle back to that idea that we talked about before with oftentimes seeing on training plans something that says rest day or yoga. The way that Sage put it to us in our training was that if you want to know if something is appropriate for rest day or yoga, you should not need to take a shower after that yoga practice. So if your yoga practice brought you to the point of sweating that you need to take a shower, that was not probably rest day yoga. So it should be that gentle that you don't feel that it was a workout and you don't feel like you need to take a shower afterwards. That's restorative yoga, gentle yoga, yin yoga. And then I relisted some of these types of yoga that we talked about earlier in descending order from the most vigorous style of yoga. So the one that's you're gonna break out into a sweat, it's done in a hot room, it's constantly flowing, it's power yoga, to the most relaxing style of yoga. And that's your yin yoga, your restorative yoga, even just a gentle meditation or visualization practice. So special considerations for athletes when it comes to yoga. So a couple of things. So what is the goal or focus of your current training plan? And that goes back to that little chart or graph that I showed you to match the current phase of your training plan with an appropriate type of yoga to support it. When are you practicing this yoga? So is the yoga being done on your rest day, and is it appropriate rest day yoga? Are you using yoga as a warm-up before your run, in which case you want something a little bit more dynamic, you want to get your muscles warmed up? Or are you using it as a cool down after yoga, where you want to gently stretch the muscles that have already been worked? What muscle groups does your sport use? So again, if we're talking about running, we're using primarily the leg muscles, we're using quads, we're using hamstrings, we're using the calves. So these muscles that get overused are probably tight. So they probably need to be stretched. So keep in mind what muscles your sport is using. What muscles might be weak? Again, we talked about for runners, quite often the foot intrinsic muscles, postural muscles. How can we use yoga to support that? And then what are the planes of motion of your sport? Running, forward, that's it. forward, forward, forward. We don't often move laterally, backwards, or any different planes of motion. So it might be beneficial for you to use yoga to begin to work some of these different planes of motion to strengthen in that direction. And then, does your sport use more focus or presence? And is there any pain or injury to consider? So when considering any pain or injury, if you've already had it assessed by a doctor or a therapist, they might be able to give you some ideas in terms of yoga that you should or should not do, anything that you should avoid, movements you should avoid. If not, it might be beneficial for you to see a doctor or a physical therapist that can help you work through that, and then maybe help you to match appropriate yoga to help support that injury. So now that you're all excited to start some yoga, where do we begin? So it's really important to find the right class. Right now, during the time of COVID, it's a little challenging. Not all yoga studios or gyms are back open up to live in-person classes. But the good news about that is there is a ton of online yoga available right now. When finding the right class, if you go onto a website, oftentimes you'll find a description of the class. And it's really important to read that description and make sure it's what you're looking for. And if you see something listed as just yoga, get more information. What do you wear? Something you can move around comfortably in. Other than that, it doesn't really matter. You just don't want to be restricted or limited with your mobility because of your clothing or what you're wearing. And then, like I mentioned, you'll likely be expected to be practicing yoga without shoes on. Yoga studios in particular likely won't even let you wear shoes into the studio. They make you take them off outside in like a changing area or reception area. A gym might be a little bit more flexible. If you're really uncomfortable with taking your shoes off, some gyms will allow you in to a workout area or a yoga area with your shoes still on. But one of the great benefits of yoga is that it's practiced barefoot, and you get some of that strengthening. What do you bring? So again, another challenge in the time of COVID is a little bit differently. Oftentimes yoga studios have all of the props that you might need. They have mats if you need to borrow one, blocks, blankets, bolsters. Right now, unfortunately, due to COVID, they are not using shareable props and are requesting people bring their own. So a yoga mat, if you're looking for one, you could find rather inexpensively at Home Goods, Target, anywhere like that. And then make sure when you get there, talk to the teacher. So if you're new to yoga, just let them know. Just tell them this might be your first time. Let them know if you have anything specific in mind you're looking to get out of the class. Maybe let them know if you have any movements that you're supposed to limit, and make it your own. So again, if you have any aches, pains, injuries, mobility limitations, make sure to take that into account when you're practicing yoga and do what feels right for your body. Don't feel that yoga is not a competition. This is often one of the hardest things for athletes that are new to yoga to kind of wrap their head around, is that it's not a competition at all. So try not to compare yourself to the person on the mat next to you, and really be mindful of what feels best in your body when you're practicing. So here's a bunch of recommendations for if you are interested in starting yoga. So my favorite resource from Sage Roundtree is this little book right here. It's called Athlete's Pocket Guide to Yoga, listed right at the top there. It's really great. She has short yoga sequences with all of the pictures and specific sequences. So this one right here, hard to see, but it says IT band flow, specifically addresses IT band tightness. She's got lower leg stretches, and she has them all laid out with pictures that you can kind of walk yourself through. You can look up whatever it is you're looking to get out of your yoga practice, and she'll have a short sequence. So this is my favorite one that I recommend to people all the time. It's small. You can pop it in your workout bag after a run, pull one out, and do a short, cool down stretch. She also has runner's guide to yoga. And if you're kind of an anatomy person and you want to see what each pose is doing, then I really recommend the Science of Yoga book that's listed there by Ann Swanson. And there's really amazing color pictures that show you which muscles are engaging with a pose and which muscles are stretching with a pose. So if you're trying to work through some of this on your own and you want to strengthen a specific muscle or stretch a specific muscle, you can kind of go through and see right here what's happening in every single bit of the body with each pose. So this is a really great one. And if you're looking for some online yoga, yogavibes.com is a website that offers all different yoga classes, but I really like it because it has classes with Sage Roundtree. She has specific athletes classes and runners classes, as does Yeni Tarma. So Yoga Vibes is a website, offers classes from teachers all over the world, I believe, and they do have a free trial if you're looking for some classes to test out there. So that is what I have for you so far. My email address is on there, so please feel free to take down my email address. You can message questions in the comments or the chat. You can email me if you have any specific questions. I know that Joe has some questions that were sent in advance with registration, so I guess that might be a good place to start.
Great. Well, Danielle, thank you so much. It was interesting. I've gotten to work with you throughout the whole process of staging these events, but hearing more about how yoga can be used in unique ways in which it helps to strengthen you as a runner and just in general, right, to counteract sport sometimes, I think is absolutely amazing. So thank you. I do have some questions that had come in advance. Also, you have been unmuted. All the participants have been, and you can manually unmute your microphone if you'd like to jump in and ask a question. But let me just start by asking a question that just came in as shin splints. So I think someone's really just concerned about shin splints, and I would take that into the context of what can yoga do to help with shin splints?
Yeah, so I think one of the best benefits of yoga in relation to shin splints might be that foot intrinsic strengthening that we talked a little bit about. I would also, again, recommend here, if you have not already been assessed by either a physical therapist or a doctor, just confirm that shin splints is what you're dealing with and see if it's, to the point where you need to take a break from running to allow it to heal. Because otherwise, maybe some glute strengthening, you can get a lot of glute lower leg strengthening from yoga. Also, yoga is great if you do need to cut back on your running a little bit. You can get some of the benefits of the strengthening, the endurance training, the balance through a yoga practice without that kind of repetitive loading, because shin splints is irritated by that repetitive loading and stress of running. So you can continue to get some of the benefits that you're looking for out of, a workout or out of your running through yoga without the loading.
That's great. And I'm going to just ask a little bit of a follow-up question. It's always a good idea to remind folks who are participating and those who may view this in the future that not only do we have outpatient clinics with physical therapists like yourself, but we also have physical medicine and rehabilitation docs throughout the network here at Spaulding. So even if you don't have a doc that you're working with, someone could come in, make an appointment with one of the docs, and then be referred to someone within the clinic for treatment, correct? Mm-hmm. Great. The next question, any advice for minimizing the exacerbation of hallux rigidus caused by running?
So I did drop a picture in here. So these are all those kind of, when I keep referring to the foot intrinsic muscles, these are all the muscles of the foot. And this is what we're talking about. So when you have shoes on all the time, these muscles don't get strengthened. So similar to the last question, so for those that aren't familiar with hallux rigidus, it's a limitation or decreased range of motion of the big toe, the great toe, and it can be very painful. And the reason that this can get flared up with running is that the big toe plays a big role in that pushing off with gait and running. And helps with that forward propulsion every time you're pushing off with running. So that repetitive loading and pushing off of the toe can be very irritating if the joint doesn't have the mobility that it needs. So again, strengthening these foot muscles, this is one where, if you're not already seeing a PT or a doctor to help address it, they can help with some maybe mobilization. And there's some other stuff that you could do through, some more managed care. But in terms of yoga, again, that foot intrinsic and lower leg strengthening can be really helpful with that. So a lot of balancing, doing a lot of work with the barefoot without the shoes on.
Great. And Danielle, as part of the questions, we had some that came in that were somewhat similar. So the next one has two parts to it. The first part is talking about just opening hips, so suggestions for opening hips. The second part says, I have hip adductor and hamstring tightness that I've tried to improve for years. It's really not affected my running. but I would like to increase my range of motion. Any poses to really get a little deeper? So sort of that whole opening up of the hips.
Yeah, so here's a picture of the hip joint. So I use this picture quite often when I'm teaching. I teach anatomy to yoga teachers in their training. And this is a picture that I use. So the bone that you see on the black background those are two different femur bones, both from humans. But you can see that head of the femur, that ball part of that joint, that goes into the socket of the hip joint, as you could see on the full picture, the left. Those are very, very different angles. So a lot of this is even dependent on your underlying structural anatomy. So you're going to have very different available mobility and range of motion depending on the shape of your skeletal structure. So you can stretch all day long, and some people are not going to get to certain ranges of motion. So I like to point that out because people tend to, really want to open the hips and stretch, and sometimes it's going to be a structural limitation no matter how much muscle length you actually have. That being said, in terms of the hip adductor and hamstring tightness in specific poses, a little hard for me to answer without knowing which poses you already might be doing or trying. So I do have the email address of the person that sent that question in. So I will be happy to send you a quick email, and maybe we could chat back and forth and learn a little bit more about what it is you're already doing so that we can maybe look at some, deeper poses to help with that muscle length a little bit. But again, always keep in mind that there's that underlying skeletal structure that can also be part of the limitation.
Great, thank you. And looking at that picture, my gosh, there is a real difference, right, in those two bones in the black box. And you can see where one would have so much more range. Okay, next question. This starts out by saying, any thoughts on how much is too much? And the reason they ask is they did 26 by 2 for about 6 months. Then they tore the meniscus, never had that ouch moment, as they did in the past. And now they're wondering, I wonder if it was during one of those 26 by 2s and I was so stretched that I didn't feel it. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm going to kind of answer this in two parts. So first of all, yes, there is such a thing as too much, as there is with anything. And this is where this little chart comes into play, because I had to look up, I believe a 26 plus 2 style yoga is similar to a Bikram, where it's 26 poses that are repeated. And again, that is appropriate if it's your off season, but if you're headed into a race or if you're at high intensity training, and then you're also adding on a vigorous high intensity practice of yoga, like a 26 plus 2 or a vinyasa or a Bikram or a power yoga, it might be too much for your body. You might not be allowing your body the time that it needs to rest and recover to be able to continue to take you through the rest of your training plan or program without injury. That being said, I don't necessarily know that the meniscus tear was related to the practice of yoga and you being so stretched that you didn't necessarily feel the tear. Because when you're doing yoga poses, the meniscus, which is, again, for anybody that doesn't know, the meniscus is kind of the cushioning between the knee joint, the two bones of the knee joint. So you're not specifically stretching at the meniscus. When you're doing yoga poses or stretches, the meniscus isn't pliable, it doesn't stretch. If it does, you tear it. So if it was a tear in that manner, you probably would feel it. Meniscus tears are very often overuse or repetitive use injuries. So likely it's something that due to repetitive stress just kind of added up to the point of it turning into an injury. And that's probably why you didn't feel it versus a more acute, ouch moment as you've seen it.
Great. And at this time, I'm just looking at the chat box. I don't see that we've had any questions come in. Well, actually, let me take that back. We do have a question that came in. You mentioned that yoga can help with breathing through the diaphragm. Is there a specific yoga program to address that diaphragmatic breathing, Danielle?
So I wouldn't necessarily say a specific yoga program. Like there's not one style of yoga that's really more breath focused than others. But most yoga practices do incorporate some sort of breath work, often a diaphragmatic breathing. There are a lot of different yoga breathing styles. There's a technique where they call alternate nostril breathing, where you kind of go in one side and out the other side, and you alternate back and forth with breathing. And that's meant to have a balancing effect on the body. And it's really fascinating. There's actually research behind that one as well. So different yoga practices will incorporate different types of breathing, but you also can just make a breathing practice out of it. You can set a timer and do 10 minutes of a diaphragmatic breathing. And I'm happy to, if whoever asked that wants to leave their email address, I'm happy to send them some videos that go into some detail about how to engage the diaphragm to have a diaphragmatic breathing practice. And then you can incorporate that into other yoga or other exercise or movement practice.
Great. And probably a good idea to remind people what you've been saying all along. If somebody's just advertising yoga, right, check into it, figure out what it is they're doing, try and establish what the program is about, right? So they may, in that process, come across classes that incorporate diaphragmatic breathing and other aspects of the work. Okay, great. At this point, I'll give the group an opportunity to ask any questions if anyone wants to. Otherwise, I'll continue with what I have. All right. If you do have any questions, you can pop them in the chat box if you don't feel comfortable unmuting your mic. So Danielle, kind of a basic question, and I actually have this question myself, so you can answer this for me too. How often do I need to do yoga to see an effect?
So it kind of depends on, again, what's your intention of the practice. So if you're looking for some strengthening and strength building, and that's the type of practice you're doing, if you want to actually see and experience some strength gains out of it, you probably need to be doing it several times a week, the same as you would with any sort of strength training. If you're looking to really focus on relaxation and meditation, you might want to start with a short practice every other day, even if it's 5 minutes of mindfulness and then breathing, and then build upon that. If you're looking for, you're training for a marathon and you want that rest day type of yoga, that might be, the day after your long run, you consistently do a gentle or restorative yoga class. So I think that's pretty dependent on what the intention of your yoga practice is and what you're looking to get out of it.
Okay. And Danielle, I have a question that I'm going to insert at this point from me personally.
Sure.
You really demonstrated a range within yoga, right? From very restful to sort of very strengthening. When one starts yoga, do you start in a particular place and move to a particular place? I understand in the context of training that you want 180 degrees from what you're doing, physically, right? But if we take it out of that context, if I'm just new to yoga, is there a recommendation or a thought process on how to get involved?
Yeah, so I definitely would take into consideration your general mobility as is. So I tend to work with an older population in my physical therapy practice and want to get a lot of them into yoga. So a lot of them, though, would have difficulty getting up and down off the floor. So I might recommend for them to look for a chair yoga or find even a standing yoga practice that doesn't do floor practice. They don't have to transition up and down the floor. Somebody that can transition up and down from the floor comfortably and safely, but doesn't have yoga experience, I typically recommend they start with a gentle style class so that you start to learn some of the foundations, some of the movements, some of the poses. And it's typically at a little bit of a slower pace so that you can build a general comfort level with the different poses. There are also a lot of studios offer kind of like introductory or foundation type of series or classes. So it might be like a 6-week series where you're introduced to the practice of yoga. They might teach you some of the breath work, a little bit of meditation, go over the basic poses that you can expect to see in a class. And then after that 6 weeks or so, you've built a comfort level and a confidence where you can transition to going to general community classes and feel good.
Okay. That's all helpful advice for someone new like me who's interested in learning. I think you already addressed this, but can yoga help if I have a running injury?
Yeah, so it depends on what the injury is and if it's appropriate for you to be doing yoga with that injury. So Ideally based, I guess, on the severity of the injury, you've seen somebody that can help guide you with that and help you determine if yoga is appropriate for you to be doing. And, you know, sometimes, again, within my physical therapy practice, if I treat runners, athletes, I do a lot of yoga with them because they might have sprained their ankle, and we'll do a lot of standing balance, barefoot work to strengthen the foot and ankle muscles. So yoga can actually be great to support your recovery and your therapy from an injury. There's other times where, depending on the injury, it might be determined that certain either styles or positions within yoga aren't appropriate for you to be doing. So it's kind of good to have had some sort of consultation and have an idea of if there's any limitations to movement that you know, should be avoiding.
Okay, great. And in that vein, in sort of kind of flipping it around a little bit, this question is about, you know, someone hearing that people have gotten injured during yoga. So should I be concerned about starting yoga if I've never done it before? And I think my personal question kind of got at that a little bit, but dealing with this idea of getting hurt during yoga, what are the thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's way more yoga injuries than I would like to hear about, unfortunately. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for that. So first is that competitive nature that a lot of people tend to have, and people think they need to go deeper into a pose or farther into a pose. And that's not necessarily the case. As I showed you with that picture, everybody's bodies are built differently. We all have different, you know, activity levels and strengths and imbalances. And so you really, I think a really important piece of yoga that I think can be taught in yoga and then carried over to other activities is that idea of just listening to your body and knowing what you're feeling as you're in these different positions, and maybe holding back a little bit. You don't need to, you know, put your leg behind your head. You don't necessarily need to put your hands on the floor when you're folding forward. You need to kind of be aware of what your body is feeling and not push farther or deeper. Unfortunately, there's also some history of people being injured in yoga classes by yoga teachers coming around and, you know, giving a physical hands-on assist. And I think in the past couple of years, they've been taking a close look at that within the yoga community, and when it's appropriate to put your hands on someone and not. And so I think that's as simple as you know, as a yoga teacher, I don't do very much of that because I think everybody should be going to the comfort level of their own body. But a lot of yoga studios have also implemented something that they call consent cards. And so you might get a card at the start of the class that on one side says like, yes, I'm comfortable with hands-on assists. And on the other side, it says like, no, thanks, I'm happy to practice on my own today. And so if a studio has those cards, feel free to grab one and put it on your mat, especially if you know that you're dealing with an injury and you just want to kind of like do your own thing and not have to be concerned about somebody else putting any added pressure on you. Just let the teacher know that you would prefer to practice on your own and not have hands-on. But I think a big part of that is kind of listening to your body, not overdoing it, and working within that appropriate range for your body.
Yeah, it's that informed piece, which obviously comes with working with someone like yourself or having a history of knowing, especially that injury, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having a history of understanding what your limitations may be and how to safely begin to work toward, you know, kind of work toward stretching and healing and doing all those wonderful things yoga can do. All right, great. And then I have one last question. I'm just quickly checking the chat. Let's see. What is the best way to start yoga if one is a total beginner? I think I asked that, so we do have that. We do have that reference. And in sort of in that vein, is there a difference between yoga at a yoga studio, at a gym, or doing it at home? And I guess you kind of made reference to what COVID has done to the practice of yoga, right?
Yeah.
But I'm someone who, and it's not my question, but I'm someone who did practice yoga through like digital means, right? So I learned a little bit at home, but that's pretty flat. It wasn't a live instructor. It was, you know, someone just teaching you. So what are your thoughts on that? Studio, gym, home?
Yeah, so I think you're going to get a little bit of a different experience in each of those settings. You know, I think that oftentimes for runners and athletes, a gym setting is just kind of a little bit more of a comfortable environment. Walking into a yoga studio can be intimidating and not, you know, be comfortable if you're not used to that environment. So oftentimes, and that's why I recommend check with your local running store. I taught yoga at Marathon Sports. So your running store might offer yoga classes. And I always feel like that's a great introductory place for yoga for runners, because you're probably comfortable in your local running store. But you're typically going to get the same yoga teachers that might teach at a yoga studio that also teach at a gym. It should be the same type of certification and background. The minimum, or what should be the minimum, training for a yoga teacher is a 200-hour training. And so that's what most yoga teachers should have. But then again, there's all sorts of kind of continuing ed type of stuff teachers can take, and they might have specialties. But you should be getting a similar style of yoga. You might be getting a little bit more of the philosophy and history of yoga, maybe a little bit more of the breath work, the pranayama breath work, and the meditative aspect of yoga. You might find a little bit more of that in the yoga studio versus in a gym, but it's going to definitely depend on the teacher. And then as far as yoga at home, there's so many great resources available now. But again, you do lose either with video, you're losing, that interactive piece where you can get feedback. And then with the live classes that are now being done via Zoom or all these different methods that people are doing virtual classes right now, again, you're not really getting somebody that can see you very well to give you any sort of feedback. And, my thought is, again, if you're kind of being aware of what your body's feeling, if you're in a position and you're like, this does not feel good, this does not feel right, chances are make an adjustment for yourself. So I think that yoga can be practiced safely at home. I think it also depends a little bit on your level of discipline. Are you someone that's going to roll out your yoga mat and do it at home? I personally, to be honest with you, I'm not great at that. Like, I need to go somewhere.
Right.
I need to get out of the house. I need to go to the yoga studio and have that environment where I've been trying during this whole, COVID time to do some yoga at home, and
it's like anything else. Some people work great at home. Some people have a challenge working at home. Some people can work out at home. Some people have to go to a gym, right? So it really, I think you have to know yourself as well. And I like the idea of, although there's not someone right with you, I love the idea of Zoom because at least there's feedback.
Yeah.
So on one end of the spectrum was my digital, it was a DVD. I'm going to tell you, it's that old. But you've got the DVD, totally non-interactive, all the way up to and including the studio experience, and that virtual piece sort of lives in between. So maybe, it's making the best of the times that we're in for the moment. And I think, a lot can be done with the virtual work. Well, with that, we are at time and just about a minute over. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Danielle Nardi for presenting this evening. I want to thank all of you for attending. And we will be, as I said, we've recorded this session. We will be putting these out, and you'll receive an email at some point as soon as they're all ready to go, letting you know where they are. You can go back and revisit any piece that you missed. Of course, if you have any questions for Danielle, she has shared her contact information, and we wish you all well. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, guys.